Professor Praveen, thank you so much for taking your time to talk with us.
Pleasure.
You're a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. You're also a founding chairperson of the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies. Apart from that, you're founding member of Agrarian South Network and journal Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy. Could you please tell us a bit more about yourself as an academic? Do you have some interesting current or upcoming projects? And perhaps something that relates to decent work agenda?
As it happens, my overall work has been very strongly around the world of work. And from a progressive perspective, it can't be anything else in a capitalist context but decent work. Right? Of course, you can always think of transcending capitalism itself, but that's a separate issue. So decent work or world of work is very much around which a lot of my work has focused through very different lenses, through different sectors, multiple dimensions and so on, broadly within a political economy framework. Right? So, and then the second part of your question, that what are the things that I'm currently engaged with, that's a very long list. But Agrarian South Network is a major passion. This journal, that takes a lot of time. Yeah. And around that we try and basically bring together a lot of scholars, researchers and so on from the global south. So I have a very strong kind of interest in looking at things from a perspective which is very different from what generally is described as Eurocentric, Northern-centric and so on.
Thank you for that. I feel like we'll only scratch the surface there. But speaking about Eurocentrism, I think we should avoid that here and move on to India,
Okay.
the focus of our talk today. Now, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the most difficult balancing acts that governments had to perform was deciding how much to pull a brake on economic activity. Now, I would say that everything can't stop, and yet it seems that that's precisely what happened in some sectors of Indian economy. What were the most significant effects and consequences of the lockdown, which was implemented with only a 4-hour notice, infamously, and especially when it comes to people's livelihoods, employment rates, and similar indicators?
Yes. You know, as it happens, it was hardly what I would imagine a well-thought strategy. The way the lockdown was implemented. So there was no question of thinking in terms of balancing different consequences and possibilities and policy measures and so on. It was more like a very ill-conceived and which is quite a trademark of the current regime for some time, you know, shock and awe kind of strategy. As you rightly said, at a notice of 4 hours, at 8 in the evening, the Prime Minister of the country makes an announcement, right? And anyone who has some connection with India, you know, even a vague connection with India, would know that unless you have a decent preparatory time, 90% plus of the population who basically dig the well on a daily basis to drink water, right? Essentially, we are talking about people who have to earn on a daily basis to survive, right? What happens to them? You know, anyone should have very easily, those who are familiar with Indian landscape and so on, first thought of this question. The regime did not. And that was a disaster. As a result of that, you had a disaster which was really prolonged. Livelihoods disappeared, right? And it was in response to it that within 3 days of that lockdown announcement, you had multitudes of people, workers, migrants in particular, right, who started walking. Walking where? Back to some place which was supposedly their home, right? Temporary home and hearth were snatched away from them. There was nothing there, right? You had landlords basically evicting them because they could not pay their rent and so on. Okay, so if you look at all these issues, no, so the world of work was massively impacted. You had all kinds of estimates by different sources, field-based work, lots of field-based work, 30%, 40%, 60% people losing the job in no time, their income levels, consumption levels plummeting. And again, the large-scale data systems also supported that. So everything that you connect with the world of work, employment, earnings, consumption, and so on, everything disappeared.
Yeah. Well, this great plight and vulnerability of Indian workers, that's not a new reality and certainly did not emerge overnight. This is a product of a long-standing structural reality which is rooted in the neoliberal reforms or the new economic policy, NEP, which started at the beginning of the 90s. So is it fair to say that the stage for this kind of disaster for the world of work was set long before the COVID-19 pandemic hit India and the world at large?
You are bang on target, absolutely correct, right? So from the early 90s, we had a set of policies known as neoliberal reforms and so on, which did restructure whatever was there in ways which fundamentally were extremely adverse. Yeah. So let me just give you one or two indicators of that, since we don't have time for a detailed conversation. Let's say if you look at what economists call employment elasticity of output, which is per unit of growth, what is the labor absorption. That from early 90s or late 80s, when it was, approximately labor absorption was 2% plus and so on, by the time you come to, let's say, 2012, 13, 14 or so, it basically has become almost zero. And then later, the next 2-3 years, it has turned negative. Right? So you may actually be growing at a growth rate which is twice as much as you were, let's say, in some distant past, 70s or whatever. But there is absolutely no employment generation, which essentially means that you have moved away what world at large, because of neoliberal reforms, has seen job-less growth to some countries which have moved to job-loss growth. So you're actually shedding labor. Yeah? And then this shows up in many other ways, real wages, etc. So yes, the structural context that we have relating to a whole range of macroeconomic variables and in particular to the world of work were hardly anything positive, right? And in that context, it is very important to remember that just before the pandemic, for the last 5-6 years, things had become much worse. This is where the current regime becomes culpable in a variety of ways. And it had acts of commission, acts of omission, which resulted in, again, let me give you, one indicator. In rural India, according to the official estimates, the per capita consumption between 11-12 and 18-19 declined by 9 percentage points over a period of 5-6 years. You have this kind of decline, unprecedented. Something like this you probably will not come across in sort of a non-war context anywhere over a prolonged period, 5-6 years. We might have some going up and going down over 2 consecutive years, but this gives you a sense of the kind of tragedy that India was already in. So jobs were disappearing, employment was kind of at, again, over the same period at which I mentioned, it had reached a point which was highest in almost 50 years. Right? So in the period over which we have comparable kind of stats and so on. In short, Yes, neoliberal reforms were making things much worse, except growth, almost most other indicators. But this period, 5-6 years just before the pandemic, had made things super worse, much worse, okay, in terms of all these indicators. And if you look at the world of work and the world of workers, it's absolutely unprecedented, the kind of context that they have got into. Yeah?
Now, neoliberal reforms also caused a significant rise in the share of informal workers in the formal sector.
Right.
Formal sector was supposed to be a big provider of decent work, and sadly that did not come to fruition. Even wage salaried workers are seeing a rise in their vulnerability.
Yes.
So the question is, do you expect these trends, especially informalization, to continue in the years to come, and how could that shape the labor market in India?
In the overall sense, yes. There might be some indicator of, let's say, decent work. For instance, some kind of social security. On that, if there is a lot of pressure from below, there might be some policies, some interventions, etc. But on the whole, this is not going to change. And this is not going to change anywhere in the world. Yeah? Unless we have very profound kind of challenges to the trajectory of neoliberalism. And because basically what does neoliberalism do? It disempowers workers. Right? That disempowering of workers is at the center of it. Cutting costs domestically, globally, and so on. So I certainly do see lots of indicators of vulnerability, informality, etc. only deepening. And then we have data too in the recent period from not only early 90s, but the more recent period, how things have become much worse and so on. Yes?
In one of your works, you stress the need to stimulate demand for recovery, and yet the focus of the government seems to have been on the supply side. You could even say that they completely neglected it. So what opportunities do you see in the context of India for a people-centered recovery? What would your advice be to the government? How to pave the way forward out of this present misery?
In terms of the possibilities on the table, there are many things which can be done. And a whole lot of economists, social scientists, activists, policy personnel, all of them have been talking about these things. Essentially, if we reduce it to the core of it, it means that the demand side needs to be addressed. And for that, what is the most important way of working on that? Strengthen workers' incomes. Right? Now, that can happen either through employment generation, or it can have other possibilities, which probably are not as good. So, for instance, giving them some support every once in a while and so on. A very well provisioned social security system is nowhere on the horizon. So what happens is it turns into small doses here and there and so on. But I think it essentially has to be a combination of many measures which focus on demand, which also means working on investment issues, which then also improve supply situation and so on. In particular, just the last point on this issue, I think it is very important to have provisions of guaranteed employment. So India has experimented with that in rural areas. Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Something similar can be done in urban areas as well. And who are demanding that work? Essentially, these are works which are at the bottom of the ladder, right? So how can we, at least those who are absolutely at the bottom of the pyramid, how can we ensure that they are not pushed into extreme vulnerabilities, right? That would be the minimum kind of ask from my side, and this is something which is feasible, We have done the calculations. I can give you all kinds of numbers to support why it is something which is not going to make the government bankrupt or anything like that. Yes, it's eminently feasible and should be done.
Yeah, well, it seems there's a serious lack of political will, among other things, to make it happen. But for the very end of this episode, we want to give our viewers something positive to chew on. So is there someone, let's say a social movement or a certain individual or something like an event, a protest or something similar that gives you hope that the push for these changes will indeed come from the bottom and affect those on the top to think differently?
Yes. There are two very specific issues which I would like to flag in this context. As you know very well, India is a very diverse kind of entity, right? It's so often it is said that it's hardly a country; it's like a continent, right? So there is a lot of economic diversity, which is being homogenized in very unfortunate ways. But let me not get into those. You have, for instance, Kerala government in this particular province, the southern tip of India, where there is a left front government which has been in power for a while. Right? We just look at their policy measures and what they have done and so on and so forth, which is even in the context of the pandemic, what they managed to achieve in terms of providing the necessary support for migrant workers and so on. So one is at the level of public policy and public engagement through governments and so on, what is happening. So that's one sort of dimension which we need to keep in mind. So some governments, some parties, formations have tended to do better, and from there you can get this conclusion that yes, not all is lost. We can see some positive outcomes here and there. Two, India is again a country of million kind of social movements, multiple movements and protests and this, that and so on, which again generates a lot of hope, which results in some mobilization, which then forces the government to at least do some things. And the most important there, for instance, the first wave of the pandemic, India was hardly hit in any significant measure by the infection or deaths and so on, and we had the most, globally, the most stringent lockdown. What happens? Later, second wave, when things are actually much worse in terms of the pandemic, the government thinks 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. Maybe that kind of lockdown, we should certainly not opt for that route. How did all that happen? Because there was a lot of pressure from below in telling the government and those who were managing the country that, look, that is not the way forward. Right? That itself was a positive. Right? So, at different levels you can talk about the connection between public policies, social movements, etc., and how that helps and so on. So there are some of these sort of positive messages that we need to take into account, and in that context, the last point which I'd like to make, from which I am drawing some hope, right, which is the movement of the farmers in the country. It possibly, in the last 50 years, is sort of in terms of its scale, its tenacity, regular mobilization and so on, it possibly is the most impressive movement of the last 5 decades or so, in terms of numbers as well. It's not getting talked about as much outside India, but this is something which has, through many interesting and innovative ways, gone beyond the peasantry, has drawn workers into its fold, and then they are setting some very important agenda. Right? Should that come to fruition even in small ways, I see a major questioning of neoliberal policies that will certainly unfold. So yes, there are multiple sort of positives that we can talk about even in the dark times, and as the great German poet Brecht had said, Bertolt Brecht, that is there singing in the dark times? Yes, of course there is singing in the dark times about the dark times. And then, that can sort of generate energy and possibilities which take you to somewhat better times, not as dark as it has been. So I would certainly not be kind of a pessimist of the worst kind. Antonio Gramsci is one of my favorites, great social scientist, and even when you have pessimism of the intellect, optimism of will is very important.
Well, thank you very much for casting that ray of sunshine and optimism, and thank you so much for, again, taking your time to sit here and talk to us. It was great honor and privilege, and I certainly wish you all the best in your further professional academic endeavors, and I hope that our paths may cross here in Kassel or somewhere else in the big wide world.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.